She wed a cold duke for duty, but on wedding night, her face flushed at the secret he could not hide. The rain fell in relentless sheets against the tall windows of Winthorpe Manor, as if the heavens themselves wept in sympathy with the trembling of Margaret's hands. October 1859, Yorkshire. The ancient stones of the great house seemed to exhale a melancholy air so profound it pressed against her chest like a living thing. She stood alone in the drawing-room, her wedding gown still draped about her in layers of ivory silk and Brussels lace, a garment purchased not for love, but for the exacting demands of propriety and social expectation. The pearl at her throat, a family heirloom passed down through generations of women whose names had been erased by time, felt less like an adornment and more like a gilded chain binding her irrevocably to her new station. Outside, the October wind rattled the window panes with insistent fury, and Margaret's grey-blue eyes traced the dark outline of the Yorkshire moors stretching endlessly beyond the manicured grounds. Those moors, she thought, looked as lonely as she felt. The marriage had been arranged with the precision of a business contract drawn up by solicitors rather than romance. Her father, a country physician of respectable standing but meagre fortune, had received the Duke's proposal as though the heavens themselves had opened and offered benediction. Adrian Hawthorne, at 42 years of age, required a wife of moderate birth, not a social climber seeking to exploit his title, but a woman possessed of quiet dignity and absolute discretion. Margaret, at 28, offered exactly these qualities in abundance. She had spent the previous decade in quiet service to her father's household and the parish, accumulating no scandal, no unseemly presumption, only the steady regard of those who knew her character to be irreproachable. What she did not offer was passion. What she had been raised never to expect was anything but indifference masquerading as duty. The wedding itself had been a ceremony of formal coldness. The church had been filled with county gentry, who had come more from curiosity than affection, watching as she walked down the aisle in her mother's veil, aware of every eye cataloguing her modest appearance, her lack of dowry, her astonishing fortune at securing a duke. The vicar had pronounced them husband and wife with mechanical precision, and when Adrian had leaned to kiss her cheek, a gesture so brief it might have been imagined, his lips had been as cold as the October morning itself. Now, hours later, standing alone in the vast drawing-room with its furniture arranged like monuments to wealth and the complete absence of warmth, Margaret allowed herself a single moment of honest despair. She had married a stranger. That stranger had revealed himself to be a man of such profound distance that he had barely met her eyes during the entire ceremony. Their union was, by all observable measures, as cold as the Yorkshire winter that would soon descend upon this house. "You are not afraid, I trust?" The voice came from the doorway, and Margaret turned with a start to find Mrs. Harriet Linford, the housekeeper, standing with her hands folded before her in the manner of a woman accustomed to managing far more than linens and household accounts. Her eyes, warm brown beneath their severe frame, held something that might have been pity, though disciplined propriety prevented her from revealing it openly. She had served in this house for more than 20 years, Margaret knew, and had attended both of the Duke's previous marriage and his subsequent widowhood. "Fear is a luxury I have learned not to afford, Mrs. Linford," Margaret replied, drawing upon every ounce of composure her upbringing had instilled. Her voice emerged steady, even as her fingers kneaded the silk of her skirt into deep creases. "His Grace requires a wife. I am capable of fulfilling that duty with all the diligence it demands." The housekeeper's expression softened almost imperceptibly, and something flickered in her gaze. Recognition, perhaps, or compassion. "Duty, Miss Margaret, that is, Her Grace. Duty is indeed what brings us through the threshold of such unions, but there is more waiting beyond it, I suspect, though the Duke himself may not yet know it. There is always more than duty, though some men require a lifetime to understand this truth." Before Margaret could formulate a response to this cryptic remark, Mrs. Linford had withdrawn with the silent efficiency of the well-trained servant, leaving her alone once more with the storm and the profound isolation that seemed to be her new constant companion. The afternoon had passed in a blur of county well-wishers and the Archbishop's elaborate blessing. She had seen little of her new husband save in formal procession, walking beside her to the altar, standing with the bearing of a man fulfilling an obligation rather than embracing a future. His dark eyes, when she had dared to glance toward them, had seemed focused upon some distant point beyond the church walls, somewhere she could not follow. His voice, when speaking his vows, had been measured and distant, as though he were reciting words he had memorized from a document but did not quite believe in his heart. His hand, when it had taken hers to slip the ring upon her finger, had been cold and firm, and he had released it the moment the deed was accomplished, as though even that small contact were an ordeal he had been obliged to endure. The wedding breakfast that followed had been a formal affair of course after course, with Margaret seated at his side, yet feeling as though she occupied a different room entirely, a different world altogether. Now, as twilight deepened into the kind of darkness that seems absolute, Margaret climbed the grand staircase toward the chambers that awaited her. The house was vast, a labyrinth of corridors and shadowed alcoves that seemed designed to emphasize the isolation of its inhabitants. She passed portraits of the Duke's ancestors, men and women frozen in oils and gilt frames, their eyes seeming to follow her progress with cold judgment. What do they see when they look at me? She wondered. A suitable match? A woman elevated beyond her station? An interloper in halls that do not welcome her? The Duchess's chambers were a study in elegant restraint, decorated in pale greens and soft lavenders, the furnishings delicate and costly, but somehow conveying an impression of profound loneliness. A four-poster bed draped in pale silk rose like an island in the center of the room. Someone, Mrs. Linford, surely with her attentive eye for such matters, had left a single candle burning on the bedside table. The flame was short, unstable, casting wavering shadows that made the room seem alive with uncertainty and possibility. Margaret removed her wedding gown with trembling fingers, handling the precious lace and silk with reverent care, hanging it carefully upon the chair where a lady's maid would collect it in the morning. The maid had already departed, having completed her duties with professional efficiency and a studied avoidance of Margaret's eyes, as though witnessing the new Duchess's vulnerability in her private chambers might somehow bind her to uncomfortable confidences. She dressed in her nightgown of fine lawn, its delicate embroidery at the collar the work of some patient hand, and brushed out her hair with meticulous care, drawing the brush through the ash-brown waves until they shone in the candlelight. She arranged herself upon the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, and waiting for what precisely she could not articulate. For duty to be discharged, for some demonstration of the conjugal expectation that all of society whispered about in drawing-rooms when ladies were removed from gentlemen's company. The protocols of marriage were understood in vague outline by any woman of her station, but her mother had died when she was but 14, and the parish wives had offered only euphemistic warnings about a wife's sacred obligation and the importance of accepting one's marital duties with grace and resignation. The clock in the corridor chimed 9:30 with sonorous clarity, then 10. The candle burned lower, its light growing ever more tenuous, the shadows on the walls deepening until they seemed almost sentient. And then, a sound. Footsteps in the corridor outside her chamber. Heavy, measured footsteps that could belong to no one but the Duke himself. Her heartbeat quickened, and every muscle in her body tensed into rigid apprehension. "This is it," some voice within her whispered. "This is the moment your life truly changes. This is when you must become a wife in more than name." But the footsteps did not slow. They did not pause before her door. Instead, they continued down the corridor with relentless purpose, and some moments later she heard a door close with finality. His chamber, she realized, in the suite adjoining her own. He would not come. The night would pass unmolested. Her virginity would remain intact, at least for this one evening. Margaret lay in the darkness, listening to the rain continue its assault upon the windows with mechanical persistence, and tried to understand the tangled emotions now coiled within her heart like serpents. Relief, certainly. Relief that she was not to be demanded of, not to be touched by a stranger's hands. But alongside that relief moved something more complicated and far more troubling, a strange, unbidden disappointment, so acute it nearly stole her breath. She had married Adrian Hawthorne to secure her father's comfort and her own position in the world. She had expected nothing of him beyond civility and the basic requirements of a gentleman. Yet, as the hours deepened into the small hours of morning, with only the rain for company and her own restless thoughts for occupation, Margaret found herself wondering about the man who slept, if indeed he slept, in the chamber adjacent to her own. What secret kept a man of his power and station so profoundly withdrawn? What weight pressed upon his shoulders with sufficient force to bend even a man of his evident strength? What had shaped the coldness in his eyes into something that seemed less like indifference and more like desperate, carefully constructed defense? The weeks following the wedding proceeded with an orderly formality that was, Margaret soon discovered, the very substance and structure of her marriage. The Duke rose early each morning, attended to estate matters and the management of his vast holdings throughout the day, and returned for a solitary dinner taken in his private study, where he reviewed accounts and correspondence with the same meticulous attention he seemed to apply to everything in his life. Margaret occupied her hours with the responsibilities of her new station, responsibilities that were neither demanding nor particularly rewarding. She maintained correspondence with the steward's wife regarding the village gardens and the school children. She reviewed household accounts with a precision her father had taught her, finding small efficiencies and economies that Mrs. Linford implemented without comment. She accepted an afternoon visit to the village school that her elevated position now obliged her to patronize, where she was received with a mixture of respect and curiosity that made her acutely aware of her newness to this world. They existed in the same expansive house as strangers who had learned to move around one another with practiced precision, ensuring they never collided, never encountered one another unexpectedly, never found themselves in proximity that might force actual conversation. At dinner, he would sit at the head of the table and she at the foot, separated by the length of mahogany and the weight of unspoken tension. He would address the servants, the business of the estate, the political news from London, everything except the woman who sat waiting for him to acknowledge her existence. Yet she began to notice small things in that time, small details that spoke of a man far more troubled than his cold exterior suggested. The way the Duke's left hand would tremble almost imperceptibly when he thought himself unobserved, the tremor appearing most pronounced when he held his wine glass or reached for the salt at dinner. The manner in which he would retreat to the library in the late evening, sometimes not emerging until dawn had broken over the moors, and from beneath that chamber's heavy wooden door, candlelight would bleed with persistent constancy throughout the small hours of the morning. The curious fact that his gloves were never ever removed, not in the drawing room, not even when the room grew warm from the fire, not even in the privacy of the estate office, where no eyes but his own would witness it. He wore them with such consistent habit that Margaret began to wonder if they were less an accessory of fashion and more a shield against the world. It was in the third week of her residence at Winthorpe Manor that Margaret first saw his hand fully, and the sight of it changed the trajectory of everything that was to follow. She had gone to the library in search of Tennyson's collected works, a volume she believed might provide comfort in those long evenings when sleep seemed impossible and her thoughts threatened to consume her. The Duke was already there, standing before the tall windows that overlooked the grounds, his back turned to the door. The autumn sun was setting with the particular intensity of that season, casting the room in the amber light of approaching twilight, the kind of light that makes all things seem more beautiful and more melancholic simultaneously. He was alone. Mrs. Linford and the other servants were occupied elsewhere in the great house, and in his solitude he had removed his gloves. Both of them. They lay upon the library table beside a closed book, discarded as though their removal had been an act of profound significance. The scar began at his left wrist, a thick, ropey thing of pale flesh, marked with darker lines, and extended up along the forearm in a pattern that suggested terrible damage and imperfect healing. It spoke eloquently of violence, of pain endured, of damage that had been sustained and somehow survived. The hand itself, though scarred, was not disfigured. It was still a strong hand, capable and whole, though forever marked by whatever trauma had created this wound. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, and she must have made some small sound, for he turned abruptly, his expression darkening into something between anger and shame. "Madam," he said, his voice sharp as broken glass, each word carefully articulated as though he were speaking across a great distance. "I did not hear you enter. I prefer to be alone in these chambers. Forgive me, Your Grace. I sought only a book. I shall depart immediately and leave you to—" She turned to retreat, but his voice halted her, arrested her movement as effectively as a hand upon her arm. "You have seen it. There is no purpose now in pretense or polite blindness." He pulled on his gloves with stiff, deliberate movements, each gesture requiring immense concentration, as though he were willing his hands to obey through sheer force of will. "You are wondering, doubtless, what occurred. Perhaps your new friends in the village have already supplied an answer. Gossip is the primary currency of small places, more valuable than pound notes and far more eagerly traded. I have wondered nothing, sir, beyond expressing the simple concern that you have suffered an injury of considerable magnitude." Margaret's voice, to her own profound surprise, remained calm and steady, though her heart thundered in her chest. Pain of this magnitude speaks of a man of considerable strength, to have endured it and survived it, and continued forward with his life. He turned to face her fully then, and for the first time since their wedding day, his dark eyes met hers without the careful distance or studied avoidance that had characterized all their previous encounters. There was surprise in that gaze, genuine surprise, and something else that made her breath catch, a terrible, fragile hope quickly suppressed and hidden behind the walls he had so carefully constructed. "You are kind, madam. Misplaced kindness, I confess, but kind nonetheless. Most would react with visible revulsion or hastily concealed pity. You seem to do neither. It is not kindness to acknowledge the truth, sir, and it is certainly not pity." Margaret moved further into the library, her courage gathering as she spoke. "Shall you tell me how it occurred, or shall we continue this dance of careful avoidance, each of us pretending that the truth does not stand between us like a third presence in every room?" He was silent for a long moment, his jaw tightening until the muscles beneath his skin became visible. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "A carriage accident, 10 years past. I was returning from town during a winter of unprecedented severity. Heavy snow, impossible roads. The horses panicked. A fox crossed before them, I believe, though the chaos was such that I never knew with certainty. The carriage overturned. I was thrown clear, but my left hand was trapped beneath the vehicle, pinned under the full weight of the carriage frame and horses in their panic." He paused, and she could see the memory moving through him like a physical thing. "I was trapped there for several hours before I was discovered. A farmer found me, brought help. They had to break bones to free me. The physician said I was fortunate to retain the hand itself. Fortunate indeed, that I retained my life." Margaret approached slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal, moving with deliberate gentleness. "And yet, you feel shame for a thing beyond your mastery. You feel as though the scars are evidence of weakness rather than survival." "I feel," he said quietly, each word emerging as though pulled from some deep place within him, "that a man of rank should maintain mastery over himself if nothing else remains within his control. This," he held up the gloved hand, now properly covered once more, "this is evidence of my failure to do so. I'm a man made imperfect. I'm a man visible in his weakness. The injury itself is nothing compared to the loss of invulnerability, the revelation that I am like all men, subject to pain and limitation." "You are a man who survived," Margaret said softly, and as she spoke she understood the truth of her own words with sudden, crystalline clarity. "That is not weakness. That is the strongest thing I have yet witnessed. To survive something that nearly destroyed you, and then to continue forward, managing an estate, bearing responsibilities, that is not weakness, Your Grace. That is courage of the highest order." He looked away from her then, toward the window and the darkening landscape beyond, where the moors seemed to stretch toward infinity. "You would do well not to invest in me sentiment I am unworthy of, Duchess. Our arrangement is one of duty. For you, the securing of your father's comfort and financial security. For me, the continuation of my line through the marriage contract. Nothing more is required. Nothing more is wise." But as he moved past her toward the door, his arm nearly brushed hers, and in that near proximity, separated by mere inches of air, Margaret felt the heat of him, the man himself, beneath the title, beneath the carefully constructed walls, and the walls behind those walls. And she understood with sudden clarity that seemed to illuminate everything that had come before, that the Duke's coldness was not absence of feeling, but rather its violent suppression, the desperate effort of a man trying to protect himself and everyone around him from the depths of emotion he believed he was no longer entitled to experience. November descended upon Yorkshire with grey skies and the kind of early frost that made the grass crunch beneath one's feet like breaking glass. The Duke had absented himself for a fortnight, attending to business in London that he deemed urgent, and Margaret found herself strangely bereft at his departure in a way she had not anticipated and could not quite articulate to herself. The house, without his presence, seemed larger and emptier, its rooms echoing with an absence that was almost palpable. She walked the corridors and found herself listening for his footsteps, pausing at doorways, hoping to encounter him. She took her meals alone, aware of the servants' careful attention, their subtle sympathy evident in every gesture. Mrs. Linford, the housekeeper, observed this silent pining with knowing eyes, but offered no direct comment, though her manner toward Margaret softened perceptibly, as though she recognized in the young Duchess something of herself, some woman who had once waited for a man who seemed determined never to notice her. The servants, however, whispered, Margaret caught fragments of their conversations when she turned corners unexpectedly. Words about the Duke's delicate condition, about his unsuitability for the marriage bed, about whether the Duchess would bear an heir, or whether the marriage would remain childless, like the previous two unions he had contracted. It was Viscountessa Eleanor Harbury, Adrian's sister-in-law and widow of his late brother, who delivered the cruelest cut with the precision of a surgeon wielding a blade. She had come for an extended visit on the eve of the Duke's return from London, ostensibly to welcome the new Duchess to society and ensure she was properly integrated into the networks of county gentry. But her words, spoken with perfect politeness and impeccable diction, dripped with insinuation and barely concealed contempt. "You must find it peculiar," Eleanor said, arranging herself upon the settee with studied elegance, her fingers adorned with rings that caught the firelight, "that a man of his Grace's standing and considerable wealth has remained so sequestered from society, so removed from the vigorous duties that typically occupy a man of his position. Surely you have observed that he is not entirely suited to the more intimate aspects of matrimony. It is a family matter, you understand, delicate, but real nonetheless, a wound that never properly healed, both in body and in spirit. You are wise, I trust, not to harbor expectations of the sort that might lead to disappointment. The Duke prefers solitude. He has made abundantly clear his unsuitability for intimate companionship of any kind." Margaret's face had flushed, not with shame but with anger at the woman's presumption and the venomous undertone of her ostensible concern. "I cannot speak to matters of which I have no knowledge, Viscountessa. I can only observe that his Grace is a man of honor, and that fact speaks more eloquently than any whispered insinuation or carefully veiled suggestion." Eleanor's smile turned cold as ice, her expression hardening into something predatory. "How admirably loyal you are, dear Margaret. Though loyalty may be profoundly misplaced, if your husband has not the capacity to fulfill the most basic expectations of marriage, you are young still, with years ahead of you. Do not hope for what cannot possibly be delivered by a man broken in spirit as well as form. Do not wait for warmth from one whose heart has long since turned to stone." That evening, after Eleanor had retired to her chambers with the satisfied air of someone who had successfully planted seeds of doubt and despair, Margaret stood once more before her looking-glass and confronted what society saw when it looked at her. A woman of modest beauty, unremarkable in every conventional measure, elevated beyond her natural station through marriage and clinging to the dignity of her position because nothing else remained to sustain her. Was Eleanor correct? Had she allowed herself to hope for something that was not merely impossible but delusional? Had she permitted a single moment of connection in the library to transform into fantasy, into the belief that a man so damaged and withdrawn could ever truly open himself to another? She lay in her bed that night, unable to sleep, listening to the November wind batter the windows, and tried to construct walls around her heart, as formidable as those Adrian had built around his own. When the Duke returned that night, arriving in the late hours when most of the household slept, it was with a kind of controlled fury that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the house. Margaret heard his carriage upon the gravel drive from her chamber, heard his footsteps in the corridor with a clarity that suggested he was walking with deliberate purpose. She heard him pause before her door, and her heart began to beat with a rhythm that threatened to overwhelm her. There was a knock, a single careful knock that spoke of consideration rather than demand. "May I enter?" His voice was muffled by the oak between them, but present, real, asking rather than commanding. She rose from her bed with movements that felt separate from her own will, her hands trembling as she took up her wrapper of pale silk. "You may, sir." He stood in the doorway for a long moment when she opened the door, a man still in travelling clothes, his dark eyes searching her face as though trying to read the truth of her, as though her expression held secrets necessary to his survival. The candlelight caught the silver at his temples more prominently than before, and she saw how exhaustion had carved deeper lines about his mouth, aging him in a way that spoke of suffering. "I have been in London 3 days," he began, his voice raw with something between fury and desperation, "considering a matter that consumed my every waking thought, a matter concerning you. Certain words were carried to my ears, words spoken by my sister-in-law regarding your character, your expectations, and my own supposed deficiency as a husband and a man." He paused, and she saw his jaw clench with the force of held emotion. "I have spent the journey home considering these words, and I have come to a terrible realization. Eleanor has wounded you as surely as she hoped to wound me. I want to know, Margaret, with absolute truth, and without any consideration for propriety or my own dignity, whether you have been subjected to cruelty and insinuation because of my limitations and my failures as a spouse." "She spoke as women of her ilk always speak, sir," Margaret replied, her voice steady though her heart raced, "with insinuation and venom wrapped in the language of concern. But her words hold no power over me unless I permit them to do so. They are merely words, and words are only as dangerous as we allow them to be." "And yet your face—" His hand reached up as though to touch her cheek, then fell again, as though he feared such a gesture might shatter her. "I can see the mark of her cruelty upon your countenance. It wounds me more profoundly than any physical injury ever could. I have spent a decade believing myself unfit for human intimacy, convinced that isolation was wisdom and distance was honor. But I return from London and discover that I am wrong, profoundly, desperately wrong in every way that matters." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "Sir, I do not understand what you mean to say. Do you not?" His voice dropped to something almost unbearable in its intensity, something that seemed to come from the very depths of his being. "Then allow me to speak plainly, though I fear I do not possess the eloquence I wish I had. Margaret, I have come to regard you as the one true light in a house that has been dark for far too long. Your presence in these halls, your dignity, your quiet strength, your refusal to diminish yourself before cruelty, your compassion for a man who has done nothing to deserve it, has awakened something in me that I believed dead, burned away by pain and shame years ago. I ask you now not as a husband bound by contract and duty, but as a man who has been shown mercy through your simple existence. Do you find me wholly repugnant? Is there any possibility, however small, that you might see beyond the damage to the heart beneath, that you might permit me to hope?" She saw it then, the terrible vulnerability in his face, the way his hands trembled at his sides, the desperate hope barely concealed behind carefully constructed pride, and the walls he had maintained for so long. This man of rank and power was laying himself bare before her, offering not demands but questions, not certainty, but desperate, almost unbearable longing. "Your Grace," she whispered, and her hand, her own hand, unrehearsed and honest, rose to touch the line of his jaw, the skin warm beneath her fingers. "I have never found you repugnant. I have found you wounded, yes. I have found you guarded and cautious. But I have also found you worthy of tenderness, worthy of understanding, worthy of love. And if you will permit it, I would offer you more than duty. I would offer you myself, wholly and without reservation, as long as you will have me." He caught her hand then, pressing it against his chest where his heart beat strong and rapid, beneath layers of cloth and carefully maintained control, and she could feel the force of his heartbeat, the physical evidence of the emotion he had kept restrained for so long. "Then I am undone," he murmured, his voice breaking slightly, "utterly and completely undone, and I find that I no longer wish to be whole." The morning after the Duke entered her chambers arrived pale and uncertain, as though the world itself was holding its breath in anticipation of transformation. Margaret woke to find Adrian still beside her, his scarred hand resting upon the pillow beside her head, his face finally softened into something approaching genuine peace, the tension that had lived in his features dissolving into something almost boyish in its vulnerability. She had not known what to expect from the night that had passed. Society whispered of passion and physical claim, but what had occurred between them was far more profound than the mechanics she had understood through veiled hints and euphemistic warnings. He had approached her not as a man asserting his rights, but as a penitent approaching something sacred. His hands, though scarred, had trembled as they touched her, and his words had been a kind of poetry she had never imagined possible. "Margaret," he had whispered into the darkness, "forgive me for keeping you waiting so long. Forgive me for being such a fool." And she had responded not with words but with actions, with the tenderness of her touch, with the acceptance of his vulnerability, until they had become, through the long hours of the night, something neither of them had been before, whole in the presence of the other. Now, as the pale light of dawn crept around the edges of the heavy curtains, he stirred and drew her closer, his scarred arm pulling her against his chest, in a gesture so tender it made her heart seem to expand until it must surely burst from her chest. "I feared," he whispered into her hair, breathing in the scent of her as though it were necessary to his survival, "that this was a dream from which I would cruelly wake, finding myself return to the cold reality of my solitude." "I am here," she replied simply, running her fingers across the scars on his arm with a tenderness that spoke of complete acceptance. As real as breath, as enduring as bone beneath skin, I will not disappear with the dawn. They lay together in the early hours of morning, not in the violent passion that society whispered about in drawing rooms and bedchambers, but in something far more profound, a communion of flesh and spirit that transcended the merely physical. It was a speaking without words of the terrible isolation each had endured, a sharing of wounds, and the beginning of healing that could only come through being fully witnessed and fully accepted. When at last they rose and dressed, it was with the careful reverence of people who have been given something precious and cannot quite believe in their good fortune. The servants who attended them that morning would later remark upon the transformation in the Duke's demeanor, the way his shoulders seemed lighter, the way his eyes held something other than guarded distance. It was Mrs. Linford who witnessed their emergence for breakfast, and the housekeeper's eyes, those sharp and observant eyes that missed nothing, narrowed briefly in assessment before a small, deeply satisfied smile played at her lips. She had worked in this house for more than 2 decades, had attended the Duke through previous marriages and devastating loss, and she alone understood the magnitude of what she was witnessing. The Duke and Duchess, she said to herself as she turned back to her ledgers, her voice carrying a note of something like benediction, have finally found their way to one another. Thank the heavens for it. The transformation in the house was swift and unmistakable to all who inhabited it. The Duke began to remove his gloves more frequently, until it became unremarkable to see his scarred arm without the barrier of cloth, until the scar itself seemed less like a mark of shame and more like evidence of survival. But more than that, his presence in the halls and drawing rooms seemed to grow lighter, less burdened by the invisible weight that had characterized his every movement before. When Margaret entered a room, his eyes found hers immediately, with a directness and openness that made the servants exchange knowing glances. When she spoke, he listened with complete attention. They began to take their meals together, and the conversation that flowed between them about literature, about the management of the estate, about philosophy and poetry, and the small observations of daily life, was marked by a warmth that seemed to thaw the very stones of the house. It was Eleanor Harbury who bore witness to this transformation during her continued residence at Winthorpe, and it was Eleanor who, upon her departure 2 weeks later, carried in her heart the bitter knowledge that her venom had somehow, impossibly, yielded honey instead of the destruction she had intended. The Duke and Duchess moved together with a synchronicity that spoke of understanding deeper than mere acquaintance, of 2 souls who had found in each other the mirror they had been seeking. They stood together when the tenants came with their annual grievances, presenting a united front of compassion and justice. They sat together in the library, their hands occasionally brushing across shared books or in the space between them, the touch becoming as necessary as breath. They walked the grounds as the first snow began to fall, their fingers intertwined, and the servants who observed them smile with an almost painful relief, as though they had been holding their breath, waiting for this moment. On Christmas Eve, Adrian gave Margaret a gift wrapped in paper the color of winter sky, the paper itself so fine it seemed almost translucent. Within it lay a simple wooden box, and when she opened the box with trembling fingers, she found within it the very candle that had burned in her chamber on their wedding night, the short, unstable candle that had cast wavering shadows on the walls as she waited for a future she could not imagine. "This candle witnessed the moment I began to hope," he said, his voice low and meant for her ears alone, his words carrying the weight of everything that had passed between them. "I retrieved it after you had slept that first night, preserved it as though it were a relic of some kind. It represented everything I could not permit myself to want: warmth, light, the possibility of being seen and accepted despite my brokenness. I have kept it all these years, a small flame of light in a room I thought forever dark. Now it marks the beginning of something I did not dare believe possible. Will you permit me to light it again, not in darkness and fear now, but in celebration of the light we have made together?" Margaret took the candle with shaking hands and set it upon the mantelpiece in the drawing room, where a fire crackled and danced. When Adrian struck the match and set flame to wick, the light spread across the room, catching the gold in his dark eyes and the silver of the tears that had gathered there without shame. She took his scarred hand in hers without hesitation, without shame, without a single moment's doubt, and held it close to her heart where it belonged. "I am here," she said again, the words that had become her promise to him, the words that contained universes of meaning. "In darkness or in light, I am here and I shall always be here." And when he leaned down to kiss her, not in the hidden privacy of their chambers, but openly, before the witnesses of the household staff and the testimony of candlelight, before the portraits of his ancestors and the future that stretched before them. It was with the whole force of a heart finally permitted to love without fear, without reservation, without the terrible burden of shame. 5 years later, the gardens of Winthorpe Manor bloomed with the first flowers of spring, their colours seeming almost impossibly vibrant after the long Yorkshire winter. Margaret stood beneath the ancient oak that marked the centre of the gardens, watching her 2 children, Catherine, aged 4 with her mother's grey-blue eyes, and James, aged 2 with his father's dark hair and determined expression, chase a brown rabbit through the tender new grass with the unself-conscious joy of childhood. Adrian stood beside her, their hands intertwined in a gesture so habitual that neither of them noticed it anymore, his scarred arm no longer hidden beneath gloves, but openly displayed beneath his rolled sleeve, the scar visible to anyone who cared to look. It was simply a part of him now, evidence not of shame but of survival, a mark that told the story of how he had learned to love. "Do you regret it?" he asked, as he had asked 1,000 times in the 5 years since their wedding, the question never quite losing its desperate urgency, as though he still could not quite believe his good fortune. The marriage that began in such cold formality? The years that might have been happier with a man unmarred by damage? A man unburdened by trauma? Margaret squeezed his hand and leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, bay rum and something distinctly Adrian. "I would not alter a single moment, Adrian. Not the darkness that came before, not the fear on that wedding night, not the hand that reaches for mine now. You were never broken. You were only waiting for someone to teach you that wounds are not shame, and that strength is not the absence of pain, but the courage to remain tender despite it, to permit yourself to be vulnerable with another soul." He drew her closer, and they stood together in the fragrant spring air, watching their children play in a garden that had learned, at last, to bloom again, watching the life they had built together spread before them like a gift they had not dared to hope for. Catherine paused in her pursuit of the rabbit and looked back at her parents, her small face breaking into a smile of pure, uncomplicated joy. James, seeing his sister's smile, began to laugh in that delighted baby way that made even the servants pause in their work to listen. "Come," Adrian said to his family, his voice warm with a happiness that would have been unimaginable to the cold man he had once been. "Come, sit with us. Tell us of the rabbit and the flowers and all the wonderful things you have discovered this morning." And as his children ran toward them, their small bodies filled with energy and life, Margaret understood that the greatest healing was not the forgetting of wounds, but the creation of something beautiful in their presence. Adrian had not become a man without scars, but he had become a man who wore his scars openly, who had learned that vulnerability was not weakness, but the deepest form of strength. If this story has touched your heart this evening, if the pages of Margaret and Adrian's journey have moved you in ways you did not anticipate, know this with absolute certainty. You, yes you, are never too broken for love, never too late for second chances, never too damaged for the tenderness of another soul. Perhaps, like Margaret, you have been told that your worth is measured by youth or beauty, or the approval of others, by your usefulness to society, or your conventional attractiveness. Perhaps you have been made to feel that you have exceeded some invisible deadline for happiness, that you have waited too long, that the best of life has passed you by. This story was created to tell you that is a lie whispered by those who do not understand the truth. Perhaps, like Adrian, you have hidden your wounds beneath layers of carefully constructed reserve, believing that vulnerability is weakness when it is truly the greatest strength available to a human heart. Perhaps you have convinced yourself that your damage disqualifies you from love, that your scars make you unworthy of being cherished, that those who see your brokenness will recoil in horror. This story exists to remind you of a simple revolutionary truth. The person who loves you truly does not ask for perfection. They ask only for your honest heart, your genuine self, your willingness to remove the gloves and show them who you really are. If Margaret's quiet dignity resonated with you, if you found yourself rooting for her to finally be seen and valued, please leave a comment below and tell us which moment made your heart stop beating. Did you weep when Adrian entered her chamber and began to tell her the truth? Did you feel his vulnerability, as though it were your own? Did you celebrate the moment when he removed his gloves and permitted himself to be fully witnessed? Your words matter more than you know. Your stories matter. They sustain us, inspire us, and remind us why we create these narratives of love and redemption. Subscribe to Victorian Love Stories and join our growing community of souls who believe that love blooms in the most unlikely gardens, that second chances are real and possible, that the coldest hearts can learn to burn with the warmth of genuine affection. Thank you for witnessing this story with us, for allowing us to accompany you on Margaret and Adrian's journey from cold duty to burning love. We are deeply grateful for the time you have dedicated to listening to their tale, for permitting your heart to open to their vulnerability and their triumph. With infinite gratitude and profound respect, Victorian Love Stories.